The wind howled like a living creature, clawing at the frozen cliffs as the last light of day sank into a sea of endless white. Somewhere in that wilderness, a small figure trudged through the snow, fur-lined boots sinking deep with every step. His name was Korr, a young hunter barely 20 winters old, and he was alone. Behind him, the rest of his tribe had moved south, chasing the herds before the great freeze sealed the valleys. But Korr had stayed behind, drawn by a stubborn sense of pride and fear. He wanted to prove that he could survive a night in the same way the ancestors once did, in the heart of the storm, with nothing but his instincts, a spear, and the strength of his will. As the blizzard thickened, his breath turned to frost, clinging to his beard and lashes. The mountains loomed like sleeping beasts around him, and the question that had begun as a whisper in his mind grew louder with every gust of wind. Could he really survive the coldest night alone? Korr reached a jagged wall of stone where a half-hidden cave waited beneath a ridge of ice. It wasn't much, barely large enough to crawl into, but to a man lost in the wilderness, it was salvation. He dropped his fur pack with a grunt and crawled inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The smell of earth, musk, and old smoke filled the air. This wasn't the first time someone had taken shelter here. Soot stains marked the ceiling, the ghosts of fires long dead. He could almost imagine the first men who had huddled here thousands of years before, faces lit by flickering flames, as they whispered prayers to the gods of warmth and life. Korr built his own fire, striking flint and stone until sparks leapt like fireflies. When the flames caught, golden light spilled across the cave walls, revealing primitive carvings, animals, spears, and swirling shapes that seemed to move in the firelight. He felt as if he had stepped back into another time, one where survival wasn't a test, but a way of existence. Outside, the wind screamed harder, shaking the mouth of the cave. Snow began to drift inward, dusting the stone floor in white. Korr wrapped himself in his heavy bear pelt, but the cold found every gap, creeping through fur and skin like an invisible serpent. His fingers numbed as he tried to sharpen his spear. He thought of his tribe, the laughter around the campfires, the warmth of his mother's stew, the sound of children playing by the river, and a hollow ache grew in his chest. The Ice Age didn't forgive loneliness. Out here in the white void, it wasn't the cold that killed first. It was the silence. He threw more wood onto the fire, watching the sparks swirl up like tiny stars, and whispered to himself, "You're not alone. They survived this. You can too." The words froze on his lips, but somehow they helped. As the night deepened, strange sound began to echo from outside, low groans of ice shifting, the faint crack of distant trees snapping under the weight of snow. Then, far off, came a sound that made Korr's blood run colder than the air. A howl, long, drawn-out, and hungry. Wolves. He rose quietly, gripping his spear tight. The fire's glow flickered against the cave walls as he moved closer to the entran. The world outside was a storm of white, but he could see shapes moving, shadows gliding between the trees. Their eyes gleamed faintly, reflecting the firelight like small suns. Korr knew that wolves were not evil, but desperate just like him. Still, desperation could drive any creature mad. He grabbed a burning stick and waved it toward the entrance, the fire flaring against the storm. The shapes vanished back into the dark. For now, when he sat back down, Korr noticed something he hadn't before. Along the deepest wall of the cave, almost hidden by soot, was an old carving. A man standing beside a fire, surrounded by wolves. But the wolves weren't attacking him. They were bowing. He traced the lines with his finger, the grooves worn smooth by time. Maybe the people who lived here once had learned something more than just survival. Maybe they had found a way to live with the beasts, not against them. The thought lingered as the fire flickered low, and Korr felt a strange calm settle over him. Outside, the wind shrieked, but within the cave, warmth and firelight painted the stone like an ancient story come alive. Dawn never truly came that night, only a paler shade of darkness. The blizzard had buried the cave entrance under a wall of snow. Korr woke gasping, the air thick and stale. He dug toward the faint light, snow crumbling over his arms and face, until a cold gust finally broke through, flooding the cave with air so sharp it felt alive. He crawled out into a world turned to crystal. The trees sagged under white weight. The river was frozen mid-flow, and silence reigned absolute. But the cold was beyond anything he'd ever known. It bit through layers of fur and into bone. He couldn't stay still. He had to move, gather wood, hunt or die. The ancient question echoed again, not from his thoughts this time, but from the land itself. Could he survive the coldest night and the day that followed it? Korr followed faint tracks in the snow, maybe reindeer, maybe elk. His breath came in bursts, clouding before his face. Hours passed, but he found nothing. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and exhaustion turned the snow into a blur of white and gray. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted movement, a small hair darting across the snow. He threw his spear, missed, cursed, and collapsed to his knees. The cold didn't just take warmth. It stole will. He thought again of his ancestors, of their spirits in the stone carvings, of the wolves outside his cave. Maybe the answer to survival wasn't in fighting the world, but listening to it. As he looked up, snowflakes drifted gently onto his face, and in that frozen silence he realized something. The cold didn't hate him. It tested him. It asked if he could adapt. And with that thought, Korr rose once more, determination burning brighter than the fire he'd left behind. By midday, the clouds began to thin and the sun returned, a pale, ghostly disk behind sheets of frost mist. Korr used its weak light to navigate toward the valley. The cave lay far behind him now, hidden beneath drifts of snow, but its warmth lingered in his thoughts. He trudged for hours through knee-deep snow until he found an ancient forest, a realm of tall pines bowed under ice. Each step was careful. Beneath the surface, the snow concealed traps of frozen roots and hidden hollows. When he finally reached the shelter of the trees, the wind eased. He paused to drink from a small pouch of melted snow water and chewed on a strip of dried meat. The taste was bitter and hard, but it was life. He thought again of the old carvings, the man and the wolves. He had driven them off with fire, but perhaps that had been a mistake. The Ice Age was not a world for those who stood alone. It belonged to those who could listen, to the land, the beasts, and the spirits that moved between both. That night, he made a new camp deep within the forest, building his fire at the base of a fallen tree. He set his traps, snares made from twisted roots and bone hooks, and covered them with snow. The stars above shone through gaps in the branches, brighter and closer than he had ever seen. As he warmed his hands by the fire, he spoke softly into the flames, repeating the old words the elders had taught him, a prayer to the spirits of warmth, wind, and prey. It wasn't superstition. It was tradition, a way to remember that he was part of a greater circle. The world was not something to conquer, but something to belong to. The fire crackled, and he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he saw a movement beyond the light, glowing eyes, silent and steady. Wolves. The same pack, perhaps, that had followed him before. But this time, they didn't come closer. They simply watched, heads tilted, steam rising from their breath. For the first time, Korr didn't reach for his spear. He only nodded once and whispered, "You're surviving too." The wolves blinked and disappeared into the dark. When dawn returned, one of his traps had caught the hare he'd missed the day before. Korr thanked the land and the spirit of the creature before skinning it carefully with a flint blade. The meat sizzled over his fire, releasing a scent that filled the frozen air with warmth and memory. For the first time in days, he ate until his belly felt full and strength returned to his limbs. He used the fur to reinforce his gloves and the bones to sharpen his tools. Nothing in the Ice Age was wasted. Everything served life's fragile balance. As he worked, he thought of how easily the cold could end man, but also of how, in its cruelty, it taught the greatest lessons. Each challenge, each night, each breath was proof of something bigger, that even in a world designed to destroy you, there was beauty in endurance. The days blurred into one another, endless white firelight in the rhythm of survival. Korr began to understand the world the way his ancestors once had. He read the sky for storms, the birds for signs of prey, the scent of wind for danger. His shelter grew stronger, a dome of snow and hide reinforced with branches, warm enough to trap his own heat. He lined the floor with pine needles and ash to keep it dry. At night he listened. to the crackle of fire, the distant thunder of glaciers shifting, and sometimes to the soft howls of wolves that no longer felt like threats, but like a strange kinship. Alone, yes, but not lonely. For in the wild, every sound, every flicker of life meant that the world still moved, and so did he. One night, the sky changed. Curtains of green and blue light rippled across the heavens, the aurora. Korr stepped out of his shelter, breath fogging the air, and stared upward in awe. The lights danced like spirits moving across the stars, silent yet alive. He remembered the stories his people told, that the lights were the fires of the ancestors, guiding lost souls home. For the first time, he felt their presence, the warmth of those who had come before, their whispers in the wind, reminding him that survival was not just about living to the cold, but finding meaning in it. He raised his spear toward the sky, not in defiance but in gratitude. "I see you," he whispered. The wind stirred, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if the world whispered back. But the Ice Age was never merciful for long. A storm struck without warning, a wall of wind and snow that blotted out the sky. Korr barely made it back to his shelter before the world vanished in white fury. For 2 days and nights, he was trapped inside, feeding his fire with every scrap of what he had gathered. Hunger returned. The smoke stung his eyes. Sleep became dangerous. Every time he closed them, he saw himself freezing into the ice, forgotten. When the storm finally passed, he emerged to find the forest half buried and silent. The world had changed again, his shelter half collapsed, the landscape transformed. Yet he was still standing, still breathing, still alive, and that, in the Ice Age, was a victory greater than any hunt. Weeks passed. The wolves became regular visitors. Sometimes they lingered at the edge of his firelight, watching him with curious calm. He began leaving scraps of meat for them, a gesture of respect. One evening, the alpha, a massive gray with scars along his muzzle, stepped forward and took the offering without aggression. Their eyes met, predator and man, bound by the same struggle against the cold. In that moment, Korr understood the carving in the cave. The wolves were not enemies, but reflections of survival itself. Fierce, loyal, enduring. The storm had taught him that the strongest shelters were not made of stone, but of understanding. He was no longer merely surviving the coldest nights. He was learning from them. When spring finally came, soft and hesitant, melting the edges of the world, Korr stood on a cliff overlooking the thawing valley. The ice cracked below, rivers roared anew, and the air smelled of life again. He looked down at his hands, scarred and strong, and realized he was no longer the same man who had entered that cave so long ago. He had become something else, something older, wilder, more complete. The cold had stripped him of weakness, of fear, of everything but truth. Could anyone survive the coldest nights inside a caveman shelter? Perhaps not the way we think. Survival wasn't about fire or food or strength. It was about becoming part of the earth that tested you. Korr smiled faintly as the wind brushed past him, carrying with it a distant sound, the howl of wolves, not as a warning, but as a farewell. The Ice Age was ending, but its lesson would remain forever. Even in the harshest cold, the heart that dares to endure can outlast the winter itself.